Nobody prepares you for this part. They talk endlessly about the beginning of spiritual awakening, the signs, the symptoms, the dark night of the soul, the ego death. There are entire communities built around surviving those early stages, guiding you through the chaos, validating every intense shift you feel inside. But almost no one talks about what happens when it starts to end. And if you're in that space right now, it doesn't feel like completion. It feels like something is slipping away. The intensity that once defined your journey is fading. The hunger that drove you to search, to question, to consume everything spiritual, it's not as urgent anymore. The mystical experiences that once felt undeniable are becoming quieter, less frequent. And instead of feeling grounded, you feel uncertain. You start asking yourself questions that don't have easy answers. Did I lose it? Did I fall back asleep? Was any of it even real? Because no one warned you that awakening doesn't just rise, it also settles. Carl Jung spent decades observing this exact phase in people undergoing deep psychological transformation. And what he discovered challenges almost everything modern spirituality tends to promote. This isn't failure, this isn't regression, and this isn't your ego taking control again. What you're experiencing is something far more significant, something Jung identified as the final stage of individuation. The point where awakening stops being something that happens to you and starts becoming something you are. But here's the part that unsettled even Jung himself. From the outside, this final stage looks almost identical to someone who was never awakened at all. You seem normal again. And that's exactly what creates the panic. Because during your awakening, your identity likely became intertwined with the process. You were someone changing, someone evolving, someone on a path. There was movement, intensity, meaning in the transformation itself. So when that movement slows, when the intensity fades, it feels like loss. But what Jung saw over and over again was this. People mistake integration for regression. They confuse the quiet with emptiness. And in that confusion, they try to restart the fire, seeking new teachings, new practices, even new crises, just to feel that sense of awakening again. But that impulse is exactly what prevents the process from completing. Because the goal was never to stay in the fire. The goal was to become what the fire was shaping. To understand this, Jung used a simple but powerful analogy. He said spiritual awakening behaves like a fever. When the psyche begins reorganizing itself, when old identities collapse, when shadow material rises, when the ego starts restructuring around a deeper center, everything intensifies. Emotions heighten, experiences sharpen. Reality itself can feel unstable, almost alive. That's the fever. And like any fever, it has a purpose. It burns away what no longer belongs. It forces change, but no fever is meant to last forever. Eventually, it breaks. The temperature lowers. The body shifts into recovery. And that recovery doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't feel intense. Compared to the fever, it can even feel empty. But that quiet phase is where the real healing settles in. Jung realized that awakening follows this same pattern. The intensity, the breakthroughs, the ego dissolution, those are not the destination, they are the process. And when that process has done its work, something subtle begins to happen. The fire cools, not because you failed, but because it's no longer needed. And if you don't understand that cooling can feel like everything is disappearing, when in reality, something deeper is finally stabilizing. What you're about to see are 5 specific signs, Jung identified signs that your awakening isn't fading, but completing. And the first one begins where most people feel the most confusion, when the need to keep searching quietly disappears. The first sign Jung identified is subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. The desperate hunger for spiritual knowledge begins to disappear. There was a time when you couldn't get enough. You searched constantly, books, videos, podcasts, teachings. Every new idea felt like a breakthrough. Every concept gave you language for something you had felt but couldn't explain. You weren't casually interested. You were driven. It felt necessary. Because in those early stages, your psyche was trying to reorganize itself. It needed maps. It needed frameworks. It needed confirmation that what you were experiencing wasn't madness, but transformation. Jung observed this pattern in nearly everyone undergoing genuine individuation. When the inner world begins to shift, the mind becomes hungry, almost insatiable for meaning. You collect perspectives, absorb insights, and chase clarity with urgency because internally, everything feels unstable. And that hunger serves a purpose. It gives structure to chaos. It translates experience into understanding. It helps you orient yourself in unfamiliar psychological territory. But then, gradually, something begins to change. Not abruptly, not dramatically, quietly. You open a book that would have changed your life a year ago, and it feels repetitive. You listen to a teaching that once would have captivated you, and it sounds like something you already know. Not because you memorized it, but because you recognize it. There's a difference. It's no longer information you're collecting, it's something you're already living. And this is where confusion sets in, because the hunger that once made you feel alive begins to fade. You reach for less, you search less, you question less, and without that constant seeking, it can feel like you've stopped growing, like something essential has gone missing. But Jung saw this moment not as stagnation, but as maturation. The hunger disappears because it has fulfilled its function. You don't need more concepts because the concepts have become perception. You don't need more explanations because you are experiencing directly what once needed to be explained. You don't need someone to define projection. You notice it in yourself, in real time. You don't need a lecture on shadow work. You encounter it in your reactions, your triggers, your relationships. The knowledge has moved from outside to inside. Jung compared this to the difference between a student and a practitioner. A medical student studies relentlessly. They consume textbooks, memorize systems, analyze every detail. But an experienced doctor doesn't rely on constant study in the same way. The knowledge is embodied. It informs instinct. It shapes perception automatically. They haven't stopped learning. They've stopped needing to seek in order to function. The same thing is happening here. When your spiritual hunger fades, it doesn't mean your growth has ended. It means your dependence on external validation has ended. The map is no longer something you carry. It's something you are, and your psyche is signaling something important. You have what you need. It's time to stop gathering and start living. The second sign is more unsettling. You begin to lose interest in your own spiritual identity. During the height of awakening, identity becomes a necessary anchor. You needed a way to understand what was happening to you. So you found language, empath, old soul, awakened, sensitive, conscious. These weren't just labels, they were lifelines. They helped you make sense of experiences that felt overwhelming, isolating, sometimes even destabilizing. They connected you to others going through similar things. They gave your transformation a shape, and for a while, they were essential. But Jung noticed something consistent in people approaching the completion of individuation. They stopped talking about it, not because they were hiding it, because it stopped feeling central. They would come into sessions and speak about ordinary things, their work, their relationships, their daily routines. The texture of their lives became grounded in the present, not defined by the transformation they had gone through. And when their awakening was mentioned, they would acknowledge it briefly and move on, not dismissing it, but no longer orbiting around it. Jung called this the dissolution of the spiritual persona. In his framework, a persona is a mask, a structure the ego uses to organize identity and interact with the world. During awakening, the spiritual persona forms naturally. It gives coherence to an otherwise chaotic process. It tells you who you are while everything else is falling apart. But if that persona becomes permanent, it becomes a limitation, another identity, another role to perform, another way for the ego to remain in control, just in a more refined form. So, as individuation progresses, that persona begins to loosen. And that loosening feels like loss. You notice it in small ways. The label that once felt important now feels unnecessary. The urge to identify as the awakened one fades. You become less interested in being seen that way. Even your connection to spiritual communities may shift, not out of rejection, but because you no longer need them to confirm who you are. This can feel disorienting, because identity, even spiritual identity, provides stability. Without it, you can feel undefined. But Jung emphasized that this is a crucial transition. The identity was scaffolding. It supported the construction of something deeper. And now that structure can stand on its own. So the scaffolding is removed. You don't need to call yourself aware, because awareness has become your baseline. You don't need to define yourself as sensitive, because perception has become natural. You don't need to explain your depth, because you live it moment by moment. This isn't a rejection of your awakening. It's its integration. It's the point where what once felt extraordinary becomes so normal, so embedded in your experience, that giving it a label feels unnecessary, like calling yourself someone who knows how to read. It's not an identity. It's simply part of how you function. And that shift from identifying with awakening to simply embodying it is one of the clearest indicators that the process is nearing completion. The third sign is the one that surprises people the most. The desire to fix, guide, or save others begins to dissolve. Earlier in your awakening, this urge likely felt overwhelming. You saw things clearly, patterns, behaviors, unconscious dynamics, and it became almost impossible not to notice them in others. You saw people stuck in cycles. You saw suffering that could be avoided. You saw illusions that felt obvious. And naturally, you wanted to help. You wanted to explain, to guide, to wake them up. Jung referred to this as the missionary phase, and he didn't dismiss it. He understood that it comes from a genuine place of care. When you experience clarity after confusion, insight after blindness, there's a natural impulse to share that clarity, to offer others what helped you. But Jung also identified something deeper beneath that impulse, a psychological function the ego doesn't immediately recognize, because focusing on others can become a way of avoiding yourself. It can become a way of maintaining a sense of purpose, significance, even superiority, not consciously, but subtly. Being the one who sees can become an identity. Being the one who helps can become a role. And both can prevent you from confronting the final layers of your own integration. So as awakening reaches its later stages, something begins to shift. The urgency fades, not your compassion. That often deepens, but the compulsion to intervene disappears. You start to see something clearly. Everyone is on their own timeline. Everyone is moving through their own process. And your perception of someone's patterns does not create an obligation to change them. This realization can feel uncomfortable at first, even wrong, like you're becoming indifferent, like you've lost your empathy. But what's actually emerging is something Jung called mature compassion, a form of understanding that doesn't need control. You can see someone struggle without needing to fix it. You can recognize patterns without inserting yourself into them. You can care without taking responsibility for another person's transformation. And this shift changes everything, because instead of projecting outward, your attention returns inward, not in a self-absorbed way, but in an honest one. You stop using others as a mirror to validate your awareness and start facing yourself without distraction. This is one of the final movements of individuation, where the focus is no longer on changing the world around you, but on fully integrating the world within you. And if you feel that, pull the quiet withdrawal from fixing others, the release of urgency, the growing respect for each person's path. That's not detachment in the negative sense. It's completion in motion. It's your psyche letting go of what it no longer needs, so it can settle into what it has become. The fourth sign is often the most difficult to accept, because it doesn't just change how you think, it changes how reality itself feels. The extraordinary begins to fade into the ordinary, and what once felt magical, intense, and undeniably meaningful becomes quiet, stable, and almost unremarkable. During the height of awakening, everything seemed alive with significance. Synchronicities appeared everywhere, as if reality itself was responding to your inner world. You would think of someone and they would call. You would ask a question internally and find the answer appearing in unexpected places. Dreams felt symbolic, layered, almost like messages from something deeper. Life itself carried a sense of orchestration, as though there was a hidden intelligence guiding every moment. These experiences did not feel random. They felt like confirmation. They reassured you that you were on the right path, that something real was unfolding within you. Jung did not deny the authenticity of these moments. In fact, he studied synchronicity extensively and recognized that these experiences reflect a genuine relationship between the psyche and the external world. However, what he emphasized, and what most people misunderstand, is that the intensity of these experiences is not the goal of awakening. It is a byproduct of transformation. When the psyche undergoes deep reorganization, the boundary between the conscious and unconscious becomes more permeable. Archetypal material rises to the surface. Old structures dissolve, and new patterns begin to form. In that heightened state, reality appears more connected, more meaningful, more alive. But this intensity is not meant to last. As the transformation stabilizes, the psyche no longer requires that level of activation. The synchronicities become less frequent. The dreams lose their dramatic symbolism. The sense of constant meaning softens. Reality stops shimmering and begins to feel solid again. And this is where many people become deeply unsettled, because they interpret the loss of intensity as a loss of connection. They assume something has gone wrong. They begin searching for signs again, trying to recreate the experiences that once guided them. They analyze coincidence, chain meaning, and attempt to force the return of what once felt natural. Jung made a crucial distinction here. These extraordinary experiences are not the transformation itself. They are symptoms of transformation. He compared them to sparks that fly when metal is being forged. The sparks are bright, dramatic, and captivating, but they are not the final result. The transformation is the forged structure that remains once the sparks have disappeared. When the extraordinary becomes ordinary, it does not mean that depth has vanished. It means that depth has become stable. You no longer experience alignment as something surprising because you are living in alignment continuously. You no longer rely on dramatic insight because understanding has become part of your perception. Meaning is no longer something you search for, it is something you quietly recognize without effort. Jung illustrated this transition through the analogy of love. In the beginning, love is intense and overwhelming. Every moment feels significant. Every interaction carries emotional weight, and the connection feels almost transcendent. But as the relationship matures, that intensity transforms. It becomes quieter, more grounded, less dramatic, but more enduring. And no one who truly understands love would trade that depth for the initial intensity. Because the intensity was never the relationship itself, it was the beginning of it. Awakening follows the same pattern. The mystical experiences were not the destination, they were the introduction. The fact that you can now exist without needing them is not a loss. It is evidence that something deeper has taken root within you. This is the point where many people become trapped. They grow attached to the intensity and begin to chase it, moving from one teaching to another, one practice to another, always searching for the next peak experience. They confuse the feeling of transformation with transformation itself. As a result, they remain in a constant state of seeking, never allowing the process to fully complete. Completion, however, requires something that initially feels uncomfortable. It requires the willingness to let go of the extraordinary and to trust that what remains is enough. It requires accepting that the quiet is not emptiness, but stability. Not absence, but integration. The fifth and final sign is perhaps the most paradoxical because it dissolves the very framework you have been using to understand your journey. You stop thinking of yourself as someone who is going through or has gone through a spiritual awakening. This does not happen because the experience was insignificant or forgotten. It happens because the category itself no longer feels necessary. Earlier in your journey, everything was interpreted through the lens of awakening. Your experiences, your emotions, your identity, all of it was organized around the idea that you were transforming. This framework gave you clarity and direction during a time when everything felt uncertain. But Jung observed that as individuation reaches its later stages, even this framework begins to dissolve. It does not collapse dramatically. It simply becomes irrelevant. You no longer feel the need to define yourself by your transformation. You no longer feel compelled to explain your experiences using spiritual language. You no longer categorize your life as a process of awakening. Instead, you begin to experience life directly without constantly referencing the framework that once helped you understand it. This shift is subtle, and because of that, it is often overlooked. It does not feel like a breakthrough. It feels like simplicity. Jung described this as a return to the ordinary, but it is not a return to who you were before. It is a new kind of ordinary one that is grounded, integrated, and fully inhabited. He noticed that individuals who had undergone profound transformation often spoke about their lives in the simplest possible terms. They did not rely on complex spiritual language. They did not emphasize their awakening as a defining feature of their identity. When asked about their journey, they would respond in human terms. They would say they had gone through something difficult, that they had learned, that things had changed, and then they would move on. To someone still immersed in the process of awakening, this simplicity can seem underwhelming. It can even feel disappointing, as though something has been lost. But Jung recognized it as one of the clearest indicators of completion. The language of awakening is designed to help you navigate transformation while it is happening. It provides structure, meaning, and orientation during a period of instability. However, once the transformation has been integrated, continuing to rely on that language can keep you psychologically tied to a phase that has already ended. Jung compared this to physical recovery. When someone is healing from an injury, the language of rehabilitation becomes central to their experience. They think in terms of progress, limitation, and recovery. But once the body has healed, that language naturally falls away. The person does not continue to define themselves by the injury. They do not organize their life around the process of healing. They simply live. The same principle applies to awakening. When the process is complete, you do not need to identify as someone who is awakened. You do not need to describe your awareness. The way you live becomes the expression of what you once tried to understand. At this stage, presence is no longer something you practice. It is how you naturally engage with the world. Awareness is no longer something you cultivate. It is how you perceive reality. Integration is no longer a goal you are working toward. It is the baseline from which you operate. And with this shift comes a form of peace that is very different from what most people expect. It is not intense or euphoric. It is not dramatic or overwhelming. It is quiet, stable, and deeply rooted. It is the peace of someone who is no longer in conflict with themselves. Someone who has stopped trying to become and has started simply being. Jung emphasized that the purpose of individuation is not to elevate a person beyond humanity, but to bring them fully into it. It is not about becoming extraordinary, but about inhabiting the ordinary with complete awareness. It is not about escaping life, but about engaging with it more honestly and more deeply than before. This is why the final stage often goes unrecognized. It does not appear impressive. It does not produce dramatic stories or visible markers of transformation. Instead, it expresses itself through the quiet consistency of daily life. When all 5 signs are present together, they reveal something significant. The fading hunger for knowledge, the dissolution of spiritual identity, the release of the need to fix others, the transformation of the extraordinary into the ordinary, and the disappearance of the awakening framework itself are not separate phenomena. They are interconnected aspects of a single process reaching completion. They indicate that awakening is no longer something you are pursuing or experiencing as a distinct phase. It has become integrated into the structure of who you are. This does not mean that growth has ended. It means that a particular phase of growth has concluded. Awakening, as an intense and disruptive process, has done its work. What remains is the ongoing task of living from that transformation. And this is where the real challenge begins. Because without the intensity, without the constant validation, without the sense of being in a special process, you are left with something far more demanding. You are left with your life. And now, the question is no longer how to awaken. The question is how to live as someone who already has. When Jung looked at these 5 signs together, he did not see an ending in the way most people imagine endings. He saw the completion of a cycle. Not the end of growth, but the end of a specific phase of transformation, the phase that is loud, disruptive, and impossible to ignore. What follows is not another dramatic awakening, but a quieter, more demanding process. The integration of everything you have already become. Individuation does not stop here. It continues for the rest of your life, but it continues in a different register. It becomes subtle, almost invisible, woven into the fabric of ordinary existence rather than expressed through crisis or intensity. Jung often implied that the early stages of awakening resemble a revolution. They are chaotic, forceful, and transformative. They tear down what no longer works and demand that something new emerge. But a revolution cannot sustain itself indefinitely. If it succeeds, it must transition into something else, the slow, steady work of building a life. And that is where you are now. The revolution has already happened within you. The structures have been dismantled, the deeper center has emerged. But now comes the part that fewer people talk about, because it does not look impressive. It looks like living. It looks like returning to your responsibilities, your relationships, your daily routines, and inhabiting them with a level of awareness that no longer needs to be announced. This is why Jung warned against becoming attached to the awakening itself. He saw how easily people became dependent on the intensity, how they kept seeking new disruptions because they did not know how to exist without them. They confused transformation with the feeling of transformation. They chased the fire, but avoided what the fire was meant to produce. And in doing so, They remained in a constant state of becoming, never allowing themselves to arrive. Arrival, in Jung's view, is not dramatic. It does not separate you from others. It does not make your life visibly extraordinary. In fact, from the outside, it often appears as though nothing has changed at all. You walk the same streets, speak to the same people, carry out the same tasks, but internally, everything is different. There is a groundedness, a clarity, a quiet coherence that no longer depends on external validation. This is where a different kind of discipline begins. During the awakening, you were carried by intensity. There was momentum, meaning, and often a sense of guidance that made everything feel significant. But in the integration phase, none of that is as obvious. There are no constant signs, no dramatic confirmations, no clear markers telling you that you are progressing. There is only your life and the way you choose to live it. Jung considered this to be the most demanding phase of all because it requires a deeper form of trust. Not belief in something outside of you, but trust in what has already taken place within you. Trust that the transformation was real, even if it no longer feels intense. Trust that the person you have become does not need to be constantly reinforced. And most importantly, trust that the quiet, ordinary life you are living now is not a step backward, but the very outcome the process was leading toward. If you recognize these signs in yourself, the fading need to seek, the softening of identity, the release of control over others, the quieting of the extraordinary, and the disappearance of the awakening narrative, then what you are experiencing is not loss, it is completion. You are no longer in the process of awakening. You are in the process of living what that awakening made possible. And that is the part very few people reach, not because it is inaccessible, but because it requires something most resist. It requires letting go of the need to feel special, to feel chosen, to feel like you are in the middle of something extraordinary. It requires accepting a life that, on the surface, looks completely ordinary, while knowing internally that it is anything but. Jung believed that this was the true aim of individuation, not to transcend your humanity, but to fully inhabit it, not to escape the world, but to return to it with a depth that no longer needs to prove itself. Not to remain in the fire, but to become what the fire was shaping all along. And if there is any final confirmation that you are here, it is this. You no longer feel the need to ask whether you are awakened. You simply live quietly, fully, and without the need to call it anything at all.